everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am going to be doing a reading wrap-up. Technically, I guess this is like my October-November reading wrap-up, a fall reading wrap-up, but it's kind of strange. So one of these books I read in July or August and just kind of waited to put it in a wrap-up because it was fiction that I read, and then I read a whole streak of nonfiction. You can watch my last reading wrap-up to see all of that nonfiction like I fell down a hole on, and a couple more in here. But this is mostly a run of fiction, my thrillers, as usual, from like the last 6 to 8 weeks. It's just funny because I waited so long on that book I read in like July, August that now it's out. So how apropos. So that book is The Good Girls by Claire Eliza Bartlett. So this is a YA, I mean, you would class it as a YA thriller, but I would actually more accurately call it's really a YA suspense. I found it very character-driven, very mood-driven, and I really liked that. It gave me kind of, in a weird way, almost a classic YA feel. Like I could see this book having been published, with a little asterisk there, you know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, but in a good way. It didn't feel too juvenile. It didn't feel too like new adulty grown up. It fell into a really nice sweet spot of, I could see actual teens, TM, really liking this book, devouring this book. It's got strong writing, interesting characters, and it develops a mood and a tone over the course of the book. But I didn't feel it was like a breakneck, page-turning thriller in that sense. I'd say the closest read-alike to it in that sense is another book I read earlier this year that gave me similar vibes, which was All the Pretty Things by Emily Arsenal. Also gave me a very nice kind of narrative storytelling suspense mood vibe. And part of that here is that this is in third person alternating POV, and I think that's what kind of contributed to that vibe. Well, what is it about, you ask? So those multi-POVs are girls at a high school who are all under suspicion for something happening to a student named Emma. Emma has disappeared, and it looks like there was probably foul play at the place that she disappeared, which was this place in the woods near this raging river where a lot of people have either committed suicide or have died, and there's a video of someone allegedly pushing her off a bridge, and they haven't found a body. And so the police are investigating, and they're interviewing these girls who kind of fit into stereotypes at the school. So like you have like your slutty, that goes in quotes because the book is deconstructing stereotypes like that, like your bad girl who like smokes and drinks and sneaks out. You have your kind of brainy girl who is competing against the girl Emma for a scholarship to college. You have the stereotypical mean girl cheerleader. And then Emma herself gets chapters, kind of like you get snapshots of Emma through her diary, which one of the character finds. And so you basically get these 4 different POVs to kind of build on these ideas of the characters. And Emma is kind of that quintessential good girl. And you know from that past narrative of Emma's that she was uncovering secrets, something really, really bad had gone down with another student, and she was suspicious of something, and you're building to what was the thing, who did the thing, and did they kill her? And in the present, it's like a 48-hour, the police are interviewing, things are tightening, and kind of a race to find out what happened to Emma, who did what to Emma, whether they can trust each other, or if they are in danger. As I mentioned, this one is deconstructing the stereotypes of those 4 girl types. They're drawn with a lot of complexity. The book also has really sturdy LGBTQ rep, which is where that asterisk I mentioned, like, that would be quite unusual in kind of that classic YA feel. So it has that storytelling, moody suspense feel, but it has the fresh edge that you would expect in 2020. Overall, I really enjoyed reading it, in part because the prose was kind of above average, but my one kind of little thought is at some times it's a little try-hard in terms of being voicey with some of the girls, especially in the beginning, and I could see that rubbing some readers the wrong way. I found that didn't carry through the entire book, and overall I enjoyed the prose style and exploring the characters, but like that's just kind of something to mention. And because it is in third person, there's distance in it that it wouldn't be if it were in first person. I like that storytelling distance in a good suspense novel, but that might be something something where if you're really used to the more breakneck pace, page-turning thrillers in first person, this one might not work for you, but I thought it was a really enjoyable suspense read. So the next book I picked up is an unusual one for me. It's called This Secret Thing by Marybeth Mayhew Whalen, and this was one of those Amazon Prime free books for members, and I was in a mood and I was like, sure. So it's a domestic suspense that's very heavy on the domestic. It's very women's fiction-y, but it also has a slight suspense thread. The suspense thread being the thing that really kept me going in it, because I don't typically read women's fiction, but that does mean if women's fiction isn't typically your jam, this one might not have enough suspense for it to be enjoyable. Ultimately, it fell in the middle for me. I gave it, I think, a 3.5 stars, and I rounded it up to 4. It was an interesting reading experience. I went back to the book, interested to read it, wrapped up in the characters. There was a lot of balls in the air, a lot going on, a lot of suspense threads. I was definitely guessing up to a point, and I definitely cared about a few of the characters a good amount. But for me, the ultimate kind of downside to the book, the thing that kept it from truly landing with me in the end, is I do think it has too many POVs and it tried to do too much. The theme overall is keeping up with the Joneses, and it's set in North Carolina in the South, and you know at the beginning that a suburban house mom has been arrested for being a madam, for running an escort ring in this suburban town. And so you get multi-POVs. One is her daughter Violet, who, put a little asterisk there, she's supposed to be, I think, 15, which we're going to come back to. There's Polly, who is an older woman, and at first you don't know how she's connected, but this is barely a spoiler. She is Violet's grandmother, so she has to come in to take care of her teenage granddaughter because her daughter has been arrested. Bess is another one of the Keeping Up with the Joneses moms who used to be the best friend of the woman who was arrested, whose name is Nora, by the way, but it's kind of implied that they had a big falling out, and you don't know why, and so Violet temporarily goes to stay with Bess, and it's awkward because Bess's daughter no longer wants to be friends with Violet because Violet isn't cool anymore. It's playing on all of those sorts of things. And then there's also the POV of Casey, who is Bess's daughter. She's been away at university for a semester and mysteriously shows up when this is all happening, and she's keeping a secret and won't say why she's left college. And then there's Nico, who is a cop, and Nico's basically kind of the antagonist character because Nico suspects people in the other POVs of lying. It's a lot, to be honest, and ultimately I found the core POVs that really worked were Violet the daughter, Polly the grandmother, and Bess the friend. I personally ended up really feeling that Casey and Nico were dead weight. This is kind of getting into spoiler territory, though the problem is I found a lot of the twists super clearly telegraphed and not necessarily handled in my favorite way. The book was trying to do a lot with kind of keeping up with the Joneses, suburban culture, issues that girls deal with in terms of like feeling gawky and like wanting to date, because there's this whole thing with Violet and a boy, which I'm going to come back to. And also like double standards for women, single moms. It gets into a lot. So like slight spoiler here, I'll put a spoiler tag on for this. Ultimately, Casey's thing that I felt was clearly telegraphed from literally the first page of her POV, she was raped at college and has come home because she's traumatized, as PTSD, but she's not telling anyone in her life what happened. And she just never satisfyingly connected to the main suspense thread, because the main suspense thread is like, Nora had a partner and who is it? And did she really run an escort service? And like all that kind of stuff. So Casey just never satisfyingly connects to it. She's basically shoved into this book in order to have a Me Too plotline. It just wasn't done as elegantly as I would have wished. I found her chapters, like I was just kind of shrug emojiing at a certain point. Like this is where it felt women's fiction-y. I just did not care about, not about Casey's trauma. I didn't care about her coming home and feeling conflicted about her high school boyfriend who she broke up with before she went to college, and does she really still love him? Just literally didn't care. And then Nico the cop was a really bad POV. He was annoying at almost every instance that he was there. He ultimately, despite technically being the antagonist, didn't really contribute to the overall plot line. And we're supposed to care that he and his wife are having problems and he's moved out from their home and he misses his teenage daughter and his wife and he watches them on like security cameras, and we're supposed to care when his plot line resolves happily. And I just didn't care because I found him unpleasant in his POVs when he was being antagonistic toward the characters that we do care about, like Violet, yes, a child. And then he has a mini subplot that I won't spoil that ultimately was almost meaningless. And so I just really didn't need him as a POV. This sounds like so much negging. And I have one more thing to neg on before I get to like the reason these things bother me is that I really liked the other things. So my last thing is Violet, who is allegedly a 15-year-old girl, except she's really, really not. Her POV, I mean, because I'm a YA writer and I'm a seasoned YA reader, it just was so weird. And I guess you can get away with this when your book is targeted to adult readership, like women's fiction. But you're allegedly in the POV of a 15-year-old, and sometimes she felt 15 and sometimes she felt like 28. She's incredibly uneven. There were just times where instead of 15, she felt more like 12. Like some of her feelings about boys and her appearance was very like 6th grade, even though she's 15. And at other times she felt like a grown-ass woman. And then she's 15, she's a sophomore in high school. And her love interest, like the plot line there, which is a legit plot line, is a senior. He is 18. Definitely 18, which means he could be turning 19 any day now, and he's a high school senior, and I'm sorry, I cannot get behind boys who skeeve with sophomores. I can't support that relationship. And the weirdest part is that it literally didn't matter that she was 15 / a sophomore. She didn't need to be 15 or a sophomore. Why didn't she just make her a 17-year-old junior? I don't know. Maybe then she couldn't have gotten away with the passages where she felt like she was a 6th grader, but Violet is incredibly uneven as a YA/teen character. I still liked her POV, because now I get to what I liked, which is the emotional core of the novel, which is its relationships between women, its mothers and daughters, grandmothers and granddaughters, the kind of sins of the past and the baggage and things that we pass down. There's also a thread about golden boys and that's kind of accomplished through her love interest. So there was actually an interesting suspense thread with the boy who lives across the street who Violet likes, who may or may not have killed his girlfriend last year. You're like, wow, it went there. There are a lot of plots happening in this book. But still, the core. I really like the grandmother's POV. You find out that she was estranged from her daughter Nora, who has become this alleged madam, and so she doesn't really know her granddaughter. I liked her a lot. I liked her relationship with Violet. Nora, though she doesn't have a POV and technically really isn't on the page much because she's in jail, she's such a central figure to these POV characters. Bess, who used to be her friend, who was struggling with her own issues in her marriage and with parenting, disappointments in herself as a parent. I found all of that really compelling. I really liked those POVs and I like what they did. And thus my wish would be that the book tried to do a little less, or at least a little less with 5 POVs and had just stuck to the 3. I think it would have been a stronger book. So if you do like women's fiction or domestic suspense that's a little heavier on the domestic with interesting characters, I would recommend it, just with the caveat that at times it definitely feels like the book has too many balls in the air and they cannot satisfyingly resolve all of them. As I mentioned, basically Casey and Nico, their plot lines kind of neatly resolve before the big 3rd act climax, which is kind of a banger and pretty good. They just are borderline irrelevant to it, kind of. It just felt like a case where you didn't need to have all of these POV characters, and it's just kind of a choice made in the writing that isn't the strongest, but it was still an enjoyable read. I mean, I went back to it every night, I finished it, and I definitely cared about multiple of the characters. Next, I read The Perfect Guest by Emma Rous, and this one is basically like a British modern Gothic, which I always really, really enjoy. This is a fun guessing game one because you are ping-ponging between 3 POVs in different points in time and you're trying to connect how they all connect. So you have one character who is a teenager in the 1980s, I think it's 1988, and you know that she is an orphan. Her parents died in a car crash and so she was in an orphanage, and this lovely rich couple decided to charitably take her in for the summer, which is, I guess, a thing that happens in the UK. It's like short-term it's like summer vacation fostering, which is But the summer goes so swimmingly, she gets along really, really well with this couple's very awkward teen daughter that they decide, hey, you can keep living with us, coolsies. So she ends up living with them, I think it's for like a year and a half. So you're kind of progressing through that narrative, and there's lots of delicious tension with the daughter. There's this really weirdness where her name is Beth, and Beth starts to suspect something's kind of weird and off in the family. And of course, it's a delicious mansion with like turrets and passageways and old portraits, like all that kind of really fun gothic-y stuff. And she thinks that the parents have a secret and something is up with the daughter. So you have that. But you also have in the future, in the present, in our present now, Sadie, who is a struggling actress, and she gets an invitation to perform, to be paid to be an actress at a murder mystery party. And you, the reader, realize this murder mystery party takes place at the same mansion where the past POV takes place, but you find out there was a horrible fire, someone died, and it's been shut up for decades, but a rich millionaire person has bought it and refurbished it because now they want to host murder mystery parties there and like do B&B and stuff. So Sadie's like, cool history, bro. And she goes up to this party, and so you're going through her POV of like, you're trying to connect the dots of like what happened with Beth and the family after that summer to lead to what you know was some sort of tragic ending. Who died? But also the murder mystery party starts to get really, really weird. So you kind of build off of that. And in the midst of this, you have a third POV, a little more sparse, like it comes up less often. And it is not anchored by time, which makes it very interesting. And it is a third person kind of POV of a very bitter and angry woman. And you know that she lives in the village where the house is. And it's her kind of creeping around and being like socially awkward and like maybe having a romance with the boy who lives there. And you're trying to figure out kind of how that POV connects to everything. And it does eventually all come together for like a big third act climax, but it has like a really nice, like sleepy summer British suspense feel wrapped up in like a proper gothic, because it's like family secrets and creepy rooms and houses. And I also think it's gonna work for people who like the kind of adult thrillers that have YA crossover appeal. I really liked the teen POV. It was really well done. It was good to read. And I ultimately do like how everything came together. I enjoyed the guessing game. It had some really good kind of, you know, punches to the face at the very end, and I really enjoyed it. Next, I read And Now She's Gone by Rachel Howzell Hall. And this one is definitely interesting. It's a bit outside of my comfort zone, though in a very different way to the other one that was outside my comfort zone, because this one has a private investigator main character. And I'm normally not drawn to them, but there was something about the description of this one where I was like, interesting. And it's set in LA, which is definitely a character, which I ended up really liking. But it is third person with a PI character, and it's definitely a noir, which I think is one of its strengths. But kind of my note here is I did have to really kind of get used to the writing style. It's a very colorful, voicey, noir-y PI kind of voice. But once I got into it, I really kind of liked how it carried me through the story. Specifically, the author has a way of describing visuals, like just her ability to describe LA pollution sunsets was like really evocative. And that's the thing, like I could see LA, I could feel LA. The most of it took place in parts of LA that I'm less familiar with. And that's largely because it took place in areas of Los Angeles that are very historically and traditionally Black neighborhoods, because the main character is a Black woman, and that's a huge kind of part of her identity and parts of the story. It definitely plays with and acknowledges privilege, racism, classism, specifically as it relates to Los Angeles, which gave it a really interesting texture. But the other overarching theme, so you have your PI character who, her hot boss, it has a hot boss, so if you do like romance threads, it has a pretty good one there, tasks her with tracking down a missing woman. It's this rich doctor's girlfriend, and she has stolen his dog, and that is specifically why he wants to find his girlfriend. And Gray, the main character, is immediately kind of, her hackles go up because he's kind of a douchebag. And so she meets this doctor, and her like ping 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 Is he an abuser? Is he trying to track down a girlfriend who has run from him because he is an abusive boyfriend? And she's trying to she's not only legitimately trying to find this woman to make sure that she's safe, but she's conflicted because it's her job to track him down. Her boss, this guy is friends with her boss, in fact, but she is suspicious. Is she jeopardizing this woman's life if she tells him where she is? And it really does have that detective noir-y feel, like, you know, going here to investigate this, and it brings up new questions here, and like breaking into houses. It had a lot of really good suspense. It kind of reinvented the narrative many, many times. Things aren't as they seem constantly and consistently, but a major theme of the book is abuse, abusers escaping abuse, and the PTSD that follows victims of abuse. I don't want to really go into spoiler territory except to say that is a major theme of the novel, and it is very, very well done. Gray has a secret past, a hidden past herself. You can kind of imagine, but it definitely feeds into the person that Gray is, the way that Gray approaches this case, and kind of the rabbit hole that it does tumble down. It definitely went in some directions that I didn't expect, but were quite thrilling in kind of the way they subverted my expectations. And just overall, it is a really good, essentially modern detective noir that deals with very serious subjects, and I thought dealt with them really well. Third act especially was super tense, and I really cared about Gray as a character, and I was just very concerned for her safety. I did have one caveat / note about this one that definitely, it had an impact on my reading experience in the very end. It is vaguely spoilery, so I am going to put up a spoiler tag, but the non-spoilery side of it that I really appreciated is that Gray is described many times as a character of size, or at least a character who used to be smaller, who has put on weight and is a larger person at this time. It's never concretely said, like with a clothing size or a weight, and so you can kind of like insert into that what you will, and I really, really appreciated that rep in the character. So where I wasn't sure how I felt, but this might not impact other readers in the same way that it impacts me as a larger woman, and it's mostly just that I'm very familiar with the literal logistics of having a larger body and kind of how it works. The reason it's a slight spoiler is part of the twist with the bad guy does involve a person essentially pretending to be fat, and so a character who is in this story as kind of a fat person is first of all described as smelling like bacon, which was just a very interesting detail, and also their arms are described as being like slugs. And I shared the passage with another person who is also a fat person, and they took more offense to the description than I did. I just noted it. It didn't like trigger me or anything, but the person I shared it with really didn't like it, so your mileage is simply going to vary there. But where it basically kind of fell apart for me is because you find out it's actually a thin person who's been pretending to be fat. Part of the reveal is like they literally like remove layers of clothing, and they remove pillows that were strapped around their thighs, and that's just where logistically my brain literally stopped. That makes no sense to me. Even if you're thin, I don't see how you could physically wrap pillows around your thighs, and how anyone taking one look at a person doing that would think that, oh, that's a normal fat person, and not go, that's a thin person who has pillows wrapped around their thighs but did no special effects to change their face. I had trouble with the visual of a thin person who just put on a couple extra sweaters and strapped pillows around their thighs, but otherwise didn't do much to their face other than put on glasses. And the thing is, my face is one of the first places where I lose weight, in fact. And there's a really big difference that 50 or more pounds is gonna make on a face, especially a thin face. And so it just made me go, how on earth did our hero not guess that this was a person who was not actually a fat person? So it was like poking logical holes in it that made me think a little too hard at the height of the climax. It took me out of the climax a little bit, and I'm just not sure how I feel about it. I guess I would have been slightly more impressed if they had said that the villain like literally like took pieces of skin off their face because they went all out to pretend to be a fat person. It was just something about like the low techness of it where I was like, I don't really believe this. So yeah, that was it. It's not like major, but it's something that definitely took me out of the climax a bit and just not sure how I feel about it. But otherwise, honestly, really satisfying noir. I'm glad I went out of my comfort zone to read a PI book because I really liked like I said, the characters. It had a good romance thread, and like what it had to say about abuse and being a victim and PTSD was really impactful. Like Gray is a character who she made an impact on me and she stands out to me. I just liked that like our main character was a woman who was in her 40s, you know, not like a young thing who lived a lot of life and was allowed to be complicated and both strong and vulnerable, angry about things. Just, she's a good dynamic character and I enjoyed following her. Next, I read The Truth Hurts by Rebecca Reid. This is another Gothic British one, like Gothic British suspense, that I also ended up having slightly mixed feelings on, strictly because of the ending. So what was kind of fun about this one is that I completely forgot what it was or what it was about. It was on my Kindle. I was like, okay. So you start in the POV of a young nanny. Her boss is heinous. She claps back at her boss because she snaps and her boss fires her. She goes to a bar. They're in Spain because the rich ass family is on holiday, and she meets a dashing older man who sweeps her off her feet, like whirlwind romance, and they get married. So like he's like 15 years older than her, and so you as the reader are already like, okay. Then on their wedding night, he's like, let's not talk about the past, like you and me, like it's all about the future, like we should just like focus on the future and never talk about the past. Now normal people were like red flag, but the thing is, our main character, the nanny, has a secret. Something went down in the past and we don't know what it is yet. And so she readily agrees to this because she doesn't want him to think differently of her and maybe not love her if he knows her secret. So she's like, cool, bro. So he sweeps her off to England. He buys her this beautiful, creepy old manor house. And she's there in this manor house in the middle of nowhere. And it becomes apparent very, very quickly as she's trying to like settle in. She goes into town to buy things. And anytime she tells anyone in this village where she lives, they turn very, very quickly and treat her like a pariah. So it starts to become clear that something shady is with this house, and her husband isn't telling her something, but remember, they don't talk about the past. And anytime she questions him, he's very cagey and defensive about it. Basically, it ends up having strong Rebecca vibes. There's just no Mrs. Danvers, and it builds pretty deliciously up to this weekend where his friends come to stay in the house, and there's a ton of conflict with one of his friends specifically, who is of course his ex. And there's like the delicious moments of like the new young wife trying her hardest and it just backfiring spectacularly. And then creepy things are happening in the house and like someone might be trying to kill her. And then you're also, of course, getting the POV of a mom to 3 young kids who has a nanny in the past. And I mean, this is hardly a spoiler. It's incredibly obvious in the first chapter that her young nanny is clearly our young nanny, and you're reading the past sequence that leads up to whatever happened that is our nanny's secret. Overall, like 75 to 80% of this book was like a thumbs up, home run, British Gothic domestic suspense book. Then the end happened, and this is where I gave it a 3.5 and I rounded it up, and I just don't know how I feel about it. It definitely gave me feelings, and I can't discuss them without spoilers, though I'll give the non-spoilery reason, which is there's a big climactic finish. I'm not entirely sure I'm satisfied with what the nanny's secret was and kind of the repercussions of that, and it has something happen at the very end that emotionally I found unsatisfying. So we can talk about spoilers, and this is kind of a trigger warning. You know, I always like to give them when mental health is used in a possibly unhealthy way in thrillers. I mean, it often is, and it just depends how much it bothers you. So this one, The Nanny's Secret, I don't want to spoil the entire book for you, but it involves something related to someone else's mental health and a suicide. And I didn't really like how someone else's mental health crisis is blamed on the nanny. It was a little messy and I just didn't appreciate it. And then her guilt over that, the guilt is understandable, mind you, but it forms the entire backbone of a bonkers ending. I guess this is a full spoiler, who cares? So I didn't mention that there is a character who is the nanny's friend from London, and she eventually comes to stay with them to help her fix up the house, and because she feels really, really lonely in the village, and her friend thinks it's really creepy that the husband isn't telling her things, and it builds and builds, and at the very end, it turns out that this friend actually, she's been keeping a secret too. It turns out creepy husband actually hired or paid the friend to feed him information about where young nanny was because he fell in love with her from afar at a party and had to meet her. So the nanny's friend helped that happen. She took a payout and she's been feeling guilty about this, and she's trying to warn her friend because she's like, your husband's creepy. He fell in love with you from afar at a party and then tracked you down at a bar in Spain to arrange a meet cute. Red flag alarms going off. And it gets worse. He did a background check on her and he knows about what happened in her previous family, and one of the reasons he married her is because he figured her secret was so bad that she would accept his secret, which is basically when he was a kid, he didn't buy this house. It's his house. It's his family's house. So when he and his brother were kids, they murdered a village kid. Allegedly, his brother did the killing and his brother went to prison and he died in prison, but he was like 9 years old, the husband, so he got away with it, but the whole village hates him because he and his brother murdered someone. And that is supposed to bond them together. Her feeling guilty about someone harming themselves and him maybe actually being a killer. It's horrible that I haven't mentioned their names till now. Poppy's the nanny and Gina is her friend. So Gina is trying to save Poppy from this horrific marriage. And so she says to her friend, I will tell the whole village who he is so you can't stay here anymore, so you will come with me and I will save you from this creepy ass marriage. And Poppy is so codependently in love and thinks she's garbage and no one will ever love her because of the whole thing that happened with her last family that is poorly constructed anyway, that she murders Gina. And it basically ends with this creepy ending where she and creepy husband are like murder fam now because they murdered Gina, buried her in the backyard, and now they've moved to America to start over under new names. And I was just like, I know what it was trying to do. It was a nice dark ending. Just Poppy, the nanny character, went from 0 to 60. She went from like being a relatively reasonable person who liked her friend to murdering her friend. And I was like, what a leap. So it basically got so soapy and so ridiculous in the third act that it just didn't land well with me in the end. But definitely non-spoilery, if mental health depictions in thrillers are one of your things where you're like, I might skip this one. It kind of came out of nowhere and I was like, I can't believe the book did that, so. Next, I read 3 Perfect Liars by Heidi Perks. This was a good one, super page turner for me. I was like obsessively going back to this one because I just had to find out what happened. We have 3 POVs and it's kind of another Keeping Up with the Joneses one set in the UK. It's British thriller. And you have one woman who took maternity leave and is going back to work. She's a marketing director at an advertising agency, but she goes back to work and discovers she has literally been replaced by a much younger, ambitious woman. And you also get her POV and it's very up in the air, kind of, did she purposefully scheme to take this woman's job and why? And then you also get the POV of the wife of the man who owns the advertising agency, and these are intercut with the knowledge from the very beginning of the book that there's a horrific fire at the advertising agency and someone dies, and then the narrative POVs are from the past working up to this big event. And you're trying to piece together how these 3 women relate to each other, what their secrets are, what they're keeping from each other, what they're keeping from the reader. And I just got really, really sucked in to the social drama, because you have Laura, who's like the career woman who loves being a mother but doesn't want to lose her career, and then a lot of people judge her for going back to work. You have Jane, who is the wife of the man who owns the advertising agency. She did give up her career to raise kids, and she has all sorts of conflicted feelings about that. Plus her marriage honestly really sucks. Her husband kind of sucks. And then young Mia, who is the younger go-getter, who's like career, who does some things to really screw over Laura, and Jane gets involved in the story as well. But they all have very good reasons for doing the things they're doing. But when you're in their individual POVs, you just feel so strongly for that person. And the narrative is intercut with police interviews after the fire with their coworkers. So you're getting like the past stuff of like Laura's interactions with coworkers and how they're really judging her for not being really social with her coworkers and like coming back to work when her baby is, I think, like 6 months old or something. And then you get interviews with those same coworkers with the police, and like it all kind of builds on itself. I'm doing a horrible job of describing it, but this one had like suspense pacing that I was like obsessively reading it. And specifically, I just really connected to the different women characters and like the texture that the story was dealing with, kind of, especially with Laura. She's a tough character because you can totally see how she would be perceived as a bitch. She does things in the story that aren't very, she acts irrationally and does kind of bitchy things, but I so connected to her conflict of not being warm and fuzzy and friendly in the office all the time and being punished for it, literally punished for it. She suffers real consequences for that. And just being a private person who likes to keep private things private and everyone being, you know, kind of penalizing her. Plus just the conflict. I mean, there's so much conflict in being a mother and being a wife, but also having a job and supporting yourself and your family. And there's also a thread of rape culture in the book. I'm not going to spoil it, but there's a storyline that is also very, very textured in terms of kind of rape culture and misogyny, believing women, supporting men, and it all comes together really, really nicely. It was a really good read, solid domestic suspense, and I highly recommend it if any of this stuff kind of pings something for you. I was pulled in, I was intrigued by the characters, I kept switching sides as I was going into different people's POVs, and I think it tackles some tricky topics very, very well. Next, I got onto a nonfiction kick. I basically watched the NXIVM documentaries, which I have lots of feelings about, and I was like, I want to read a cult book, and so I read The Road to Jonestown, Jim Jones and the People's Temple by Jeff Guinn. So I knew very little about Jonestown, and I just picked it out of thin air. I know the famous, like, don't drink the Kool-Aid, pop culturism, that 900 people killed themselves at this compound in Guyana in 1978. We actually just passed the anniversary, which was November 18th, but otherwise I didn't know much about it other than Jim Jones is very famous for being a compelling cult leader. It was a fascinating read. Really well written. If you have even the tiniest interest in this subject, read it. Jeff Guinn did a beautiful job. He walks you through it from literally Jim Jones's birth to the end and beyond. And I feel like I got a very good and a complex understanding of the man, of the church, of the cult, and of the end, because it's not as simple as a crazy man recruited a bunch of people and they killed themselves. There were just things I didn't know because I didn't live through that time and we don't speak about them as much. It was a social justice church, basically. They actually had very progressive values. They attracted people who wanted to make a difference in the world. They did a lot of legitimate outreach work for racial equality and like helping the homeless and poor and elderly, like really good stuff. Jim Jones legit did anti-segregationist work in Indianapolis in the early days of the church, and it was at first a church. But it's also fascinating because he's a very specific type of narcissist, and I liked reading it through that lens. The book doesn't go into it, but I took that with me. It's the best example of communal narcissism I have ever seen, because I went in being like, well, clearly he's had a personality disorder, but which one? He's not your typical kind of malignant narcissist. He was manipulative and narcissistic in a very different way, communal narcissism. helping people, your image being based on being like a godlike figure who does good things. And it was just a really good read. It was a hard read at times, so like I do want to warn, don't read it if you can't handle, I mean, children died. It's quite horrific. That part of the book is the hardest to read for sure, the big finish, so to speak, but the book is pretty long. I think it was 500 or 600 pages, and like most of that, like 2/3 of it are the lead up. So yeah, if the subject interests you at all, I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Really, really good read. And then I just decided to read another nonfiction book because why not? And so this one I found on Kindle Unlimited, Love Lies, A True Story of Marriage and Murder in the Suburbs by Amanda Lamb, small press published. Story I'd never heard of, a mother being found dead in North Carolina. And I really liked the way that she walked you through it. The woman who wrote it is a journalist. She lived locally. I guess keeping up with the Joneses is a theme here, and the suburbs is a theme for this reading wrap up, because North Carolina suburbs, keeping up with the Joneses. She was kind of a super mom type who was very well liked. Her husband was a tech guy who people honestly didn't really like as much in the neighborhood. And I mean, they suspected him immediately when she disappeared, and then later when she was found dead. And so the woman who did live in the neighborhood, she just gives you that context at the beginning and she wraps it up in the end. Otherwise, really good journalistic distance. She covers it from start to finish. There were multiple trials, depositions, because there was a custody case because she had 2 young children. She covers the side of this woman's family fighting to save her kids. She covers the other side in the sense that she like factually covers the arguments that the defense made, different sides of like the evidence in the investigation. I thought it was a really good domestic true crime book, very heartbreaking. I definitely felt like I knew this woman. Her name was Nancy. And I also liked that through speaking with her friends and her family, she paints a complex portrait of her, not a perfect portrait of her. She was a complicated woman, a good person and a good woman. But yes, she had a shitty marriage. And it covers financial abuse very well. And that was the huge hinge. Her husband never hit her, but he 100% financially abused her. It was a bad marriage. She was trying to get out, and then she died. She was brutally murdered. You can draw your own conclusions, because I'm not going to say how the trials went, because I went in unspoiled and you should go in unspoiled too. It was a really, really good read. Very heartbreaking. I went looking, because at this point it's been over 10 years, just to make sure her kids are doing okay, like all that stuff, and they are. It was an unexpected find, just like a really good read, really fits in with my last reading wrap up, doing all those true crime ones. So if that is your bag, I really recommend it. So that is it for this. I'm currently actually reading the Diana Chronicles because of The Crown. I'm just not done, so it's not going into this reading wrap up, so I'm still kind of on a nonfiction kick, but my fiction TBR is bonkers. I got approved on NetGalley for some really good books, so I mean, we're gonna keep on keeping on. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I'm gonna keep making reading wrap ups, and if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy reading.